Welcome back. In this video I'm talking about stenciling, which is what I would consider a later stage technique. It's not quite as fundamental as top coating and outlining and flooding, but it's by no means at all complicated. In fact, it's one of my favorite techniques because it is inherently easy and it doesn't require any built-in artistic skill. It just requires a stencil and a steady hand and icing, of course, at the right consistency. To be clear, today I'm talking about stenciling with royal icing. You can also stencil with airbrush food coloring and an airbrush, but that requires investment in a whole new set of tools. And as you know, I'm not a gadget girl, so we're going to keep it simple today and just work with the ingredients that we've already learned how to use. Now, stencils used to be a thing of hardware stores, but now stencils come in a wide array of patterns. One of my favorite suppliers is designerstencils.com. They've just got a huge variety, ranging from cake stencils, which are quite large. This one's designed to stencil the side of a cake. This particular stencil also was intended to stencil the side of a cake, but I've modified it by taping it off with a little blue painter's tape to create the swirly pattern on the side of these picture frames. So you can modify cake stencils, but fortunately, you don't usually need to because they also come in cookie size and often sized to particular shapes of cookies, such as these hearts. These are sized to fit a particular heart cookie cutter. Before we get stenciling, I want to say a word about beginner versus advanced stencils, because if you're just starting out, some stencils are inherently more difficult to use than others. And this is a prime example. Here I've got a heart stencil where the openings are very, very small and the openings are also very close together. Whereas this one, they're just a little bit further apart and the openings are a little bit more wide. And what that means is that when there's more spacing between the openings, your icing can have a little more, you have a little more latitude with the icing. It doesn't have to be exactly the right consistency. If the icing's at all too thin with one of these finer stencils, it will most certainly flow underneath the stencil and create more of a blurry pattern. So if you're beginning, this is the beginner stencil of choice, a little more wide openings, maybe 1/8 of an inch apart. So let's talk about how to stencil. I am going to replicate the stencil necklace that I'm wearing, if you didn't notice that already. All of the jewelry actually in Ultimate Cookies use the stenciling technique to create the primary pattern. So both the pendants and the tiaras, and much of the jewelry you see here on the set today does that as well. Another consideration with stenciling is the icing itself. You can actually stencil a naked cookie, that is one without any icing, but I often prefer to have a coat of icing behind it for color contrast. And typically it's easiest to stencil a cookie if your stencil fits the icing top coat, not the cookie itself, but the icing top coat with a little room to spare. Actually, the more room to spare, the better, but you want to have at least 1/4 of an inch because it just, one, makes it easier to stencil, or rather center the stencil on the cookie. It also gives you a little more holding room because you're going to have to hold the stencil down as you spread icing over it. This is a bit challenging, the cookie I've chosen today. It just barely fits the icing top coat, but we're gonna try it anyway and see how it works. For the jewelry, I also cut a hole in the cookie before baking and baked it to allow a piece of licorice lace to go through it later to tie it off. So that's just a note. But I'm going to stencil right over that hole. The icing will tend to flow into that hole, but I'll worry about cleaning that out a little bit later. Okay, so let's get on to stenciling. For that I need icing at the right consistency, and that of course is icing at stenciling consistency, which is about 1/2 teaspoon to 1.5 teaspoons of water per cup of glue. I'm looking for the icing to have a little bit of body, you know, to cling to my offset spatula and not run off. It needs to be a little bit thick. There is a range on that spectrum for really fine, those advanced stencils that I just talked about. You want to work on the thicker end of the spectrum so that the icing doesn't run under the stencil. Whereas for a larger cookie, something larger than this may be 2 to 3 inches across. For a 4 to 5 inch cookie, I'd probably be working with a looser icing just to make sure I got smooth coverage across the entire stencil. So I've probably got closer to about 1/2 teaspoon of water per cup of glue because I've got a small cookie and an average stencil, I would say here. The complication with this one is that my stencil is very close to my cookie edge. I'm going to put my glasses on here so I can make sure I'm doing what I need to do correctly. And that's complicating because you need to hold the stencil in place as you're spreading the icing to make sure it doesn't move. And oftentimes if the stencil doesn't have handling room on it, that can be challenging to do with your fingertip, which is another use for the trussing needle. I use it to anchor the stencil in place. You might also find that your stencil lies more flat in one direction or the other. The flatter it lies, the less likely icing is to seep underneath it. And I think mine's a little bit flatter perhaps in this direction. Okay, we've got our icing at the right consistency. And you want to just make sure your stencil is situated on the cookie where you want it. In this case, I want it centered, so I'm just adjusting it a little. And then I'm going to pull out my handy dandy trussing needle, turkey lacer that I use for marbling and all sorts of other things. And I'm going to use that to anchor the stencil in place because I don't have any handling room on top of this one. Now, I don't need a lot of icing, and ideally you don't want it any thicker than the thickness of the stencil because when you lift up the stencil, it'll leave peaks in the icing, so I'm not going to start with very much on my spatula. This is an offset spatula. The handle is offset to the blade at about a 45-degree angle, which means it makes it easy to spread without wrapping your knuckles on the countertop. So I use these often as well. The first thing I do is apply enough icing to kind of just anchor the stencil in place rather than doing one big broad stroke because there's more chance of moving the stencil in that case. And if you move the stencil, you are going to have a very rough looking effect at the end. When I'm done getting icing kind of in all the major crevices, I will try to go over it in one fell swipe though so that I don't have tracks in the middle of my pattern. And so I'm about ready to do that. I've got it all covered. Just going to clean off the back of my spatula before I do that so I don't have any crusty icing on it. And you do want to choose a spatula that's sized to your stencil. In this case, my stencil is pretty small, so I'm using an offset that maybe has like a 4.5-inch long blade. I'd use something longer if I had a bigger stencil that would cover the whole pattern. So I think that's pretty good. I'm going to go over it one more time because I've got some track marks there. I think that's pretty clean. I haven't moved the stencil. I'm going to lift off my trussing needle, and then I typically like to pick up the stencil where there's the most handling room, which is at this tab at the end, and then just pick it up very, very quickly. And so there you have it. Gorgeous looking pattern, didn't require any artistic skill. I do have a big blob of icing though in this hole, and if I were to leave that there, it would dry and I wouldn't be able to get my licorice lace through there later. So I'm just going to pick that out again with my trussing needle, clean that out a little bit, and then set this aside for the next step. I've just finished stenciling it, and it's a pretty pattern in and of itself. You could leave it just as it is, but I'm going to come in and put some embellishments on top of it in a moment. But before I do that, I did want to talk about reuse of stencils. I've used this once. As long as there's no icing on the back and the icing on the top hasn't crusted, you can go ahead and use it immediately to stencil another cookie of the same type. But I generally only get about 2 to 3 swipes out of one stencil before the icing starts crusting on top, which interferes with the movement of the spatula, or before something starts seeping on the back. In that case, I'll go rinse it off. You want to do that under low flow water, because if you run high flow water over it, it can damage the stencil. And you want to make sure you pat it dry between paper towels rather than scrubbing the paper towel over the top of the stencil. Just pat it dry. Make sure it's completely dry, because if you set anything at all moist back down on an iced cookie, that will dissolve the icing. So that's how to take care of stencils. If you're doing a lot of stenciling, you might want to invest in more than one of the same stencil, because to have to wash every two or three applications of icing can become a little bit tedious and can slow down the process. So I am a more is more kind of person, so I do want to dress this out a little bit, and I'm trying to replicate the medallion that I've got around my neck. That had some brown lines between the pink petals on this daisy stencil, and for that I naturally used an icing of outlining consistency that's relatively thick, about a 1/2 teaspoon to 3/4 teaspoon of water to 1 cup of glue. And I want a really fine line. So I have cut a barely perceptible hole in my tip, and I'm just going to create lines that run through the middle of each of these petals, well, between them I should say. And then we're going to dress it out with a few dots. But as I said, you could leave the stencil just as it is and not do anything fussy with it. There are other ways to dress out these cookies too, which I'll talk about as soon as I complete this one. So my piping pattern, touch down at the start, don't drag the tip, and then just touch down at the end when I'm ready to break the flow of the icing. And I'm going to go all the way around. I'm about halfway around right now. Okay, I'm on my last line here. And I've applied the brown icing right away because my red top coat was completely dry, and my pink icing for stenciling was also relatively thick. So there's very little likelihood of those colors bleeding together because they're all either dry or relatively thick. If I had the luxury of time, I would wait probably half an hour for these brown lines to dry fully before I do the next step, because what I'm going to be doing next is applying a much looser white icing to create dots. And this is icing of beadwork consistency, which is about 2 to 3 teaspoons of water per 1 cup of glue. So because this icing is looser, there's much more chance of it bleeding into the brown. But since we don't have the luxury of time here today to wait for that to dry, I'm just going to show you what I would do had I let the brown dry until it had just crusted. I want to add some white dots just to give this a little more pop. And I'm going to do some teeny ones at the ends of each of these lines, and then I'm going to do some much larger ones around the perimeter of the cookie. For the teeny lines, because the icing is so loose, I don't even believe I cut a hole in this tip. It's just loose enough that it's seeping out whatever hole there might naturally be there. And I'm not having to press very much, if at all, because it's just flowing out on its own into a nice, well-rounded bead. We'll talk more about beadwork in my last video when I talk about border techniques, but I did want to touch on it here today as I'm dressing out this cookie. And so I'm just touching down, hardly applying any pressure because these are teeny tiny beads. When we get to the bigger beads on the outside of the cookie, I'll use the same bag, same consistency of icing, but I'll be pushing harder and a little bit longer to make that bead just a little bit bigger. So I'm going to continue all the way around. You'll notice my forefinger here is just steadying the tip. I'm not applying any pressure on the middle of the bag. And I'm trying to keep my hand at a 90-degree angle. If you angle it, you'll end up with something that's more oval rather than round. But every now and then I misstep and you'll see my hand slightly off kilter. I also tend to work very much over my cookies when I'm piping. I tend to be directly over them so I can see exactly where these details are falling and how they're shaped, because that's typically how you'd view a cookie, from top down. So I'm just going to complete this effect. So I've got the little dots on. Now to do the big dots, I actually might open it up a touch because it's hardly open. That way I'll have to squeeze less to create the big dots. And again, holding the bag roughly perpendicular to the cookie, just squeezing a little bit harder than I was before because I did open up the tip. And I just want to fill in the border in this manner. I call this a beaded border. Oftentimes I'll test on my work surface first the flow of the icing, because if you put the beads too close together, the icing's loose, so it'll flow more once it hits the cookie, and sometimes they can flow into each other. It's not happening now. I'm trying to make it happen. There they float into each other. So I'll often test on the work surface to make sure I'm spacing them far enough apart that they won't flow into each other, because I like to keep them separate. So I'm just going to continue around the cookie. Oops, I misplaced that one a little bit. And once you get into a groove and rhythm, it's pretty easy to modulate the pressure at which you're pushing the icing and the spacing so that the dots become uniform in size. You want them all roughly the same size. I'm going to put one big last white dot in the center. The one I've got on my neck I think has a brown dot on it, but I've got this icing handy. And there you have it. If your dot isn't perfectly perfect, again, out comes the trussing needle. You can touch it up a little bit to round it out. Now, before I string this with licorice lace, which I would do through the hole, I'd let all the elements completely dry so that I don't mess any of them up. And if you don't want to go to such great lengths to pipe all these dots, which can be a little bit time consuming, there are other ways to get dot-like effects or detail effects on cookies that don't involve piping. One use is the use of dragées, which are sugar beads. And you'll see they come in both metallic and also non-metallic in this red form here and a whole host of colors. So rather than piping those, I simply anchored them in place with a little bit of thick royal icing. We'll talk more about anchoring large objects or cookies to other cookies in my video on applique work, but that's just a quick example of it right there. Other showy items that you can add are sugar beads, or sugar gems rather. This is made of isomalt, which is a form of sugar that's less prone to clouding than normal sugar, and I got this particular one from fancyflowers.com, which was one of my favorite suppliers of all these types of sugar doodads and embellishments that you can add to cookies. So that's the gist of stenciling and a little bit of extra on top. In the next video, we'll talk about rubber stamping. Till then, live sweetly.